It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to talk about PFL and we are going to talk about Francis and Ngannou. But first, we're going to ask John how his week has been.
Oh, great. It's been, I guess, fabulous.
Fabulous.
Yeah,
Wow.
I have nothing better. I got the cat is sitting on my lap, taking advantage of me, preventing me from doing much. I'm waiting for all my money to roll in because I put all my money into this Hawk Tui Bitcoin.
Oh, did
cryptocurrency? It's going to make wait, let me just check up. Oh my God.
Did you invest all of your mother's money into this?
Yeah, all my personal savings into the Hawk coin.
The Hawk coin. That girl's going to jail, I think.
You think so? I don't know about that, but she is. Her 15 minutes of fame looks like it might be ticking to a final end.
Yeah, well, I feel like people are probably going to sue at the very least, because what that was some foulness right there, what they did. But that's for another day. Let's get into some Francis and Ngannou right now, because Turki Al-Sheikh hinted at getting a Jones versus Ngannou fight made for Riyadh season. Do you think that it's possible that he can get the UFC and the PFL to co-promote?
No. I mean, the PFL is obviously all in. They're gung-ho to co-promote. But the UFC's answer is going to be no, unless, and put one caveat, unless the fee is so high that it's inconceivable that they don't co-promote. If they throws in hundreds of millions of dollars for a site fee, or at least well over $100 million for a site fee, then there might be a possibility. But I doubt even the Saudis would be willing to spend that kind of money, because for the UFC, from their point of view, people are like, I see a lot of people arguing that the Saudis have so much money the UFC would consider it. But you got to remember, the UFC, their objectives are, one, they need to protect the moat that they built around their industry. And part of that protection includes not giving any outside fighters outside the UFC, a chance to demonstrate they're superior to UFC fighters, and to also never give another promotion legitimacy as an equal. So they can't do that. And then their second thing is the UFC is a repeat player. So you could say, well, they're going to lose money if they don't do this deal that the Saudis are putting up. Well, as a repeat player, which means that you're a long-term business, you look out for your long-term business because you're going to be here for a long time. You can lose money by turning down something that immediately make you money, but in the long term, losing that short-term money will protect your business and you'll make more money in the long term. So for those two reasons, unless the Saudis come with such a massive, insane amount of money that would add tremendous amount of money to their bottom line, this is not Mayweather versus McGregor, where it's an outside venture boxing that's not going to be in direct competition with them. So no, the answer is no.
Quick question. I saw something saying that Turki Al-Sheikh was willing to put up somewhere in the neighborhood of $700 million for a Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson Part 2. And that if Mike Tyson could knock Jake Paul out in the first 3 minutes, he would get all 700 million of it. Now, I saw this tweeted out from multiple accounts on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. I'm not sure if there was much of a source behind it, but let's say that there was. Do you think that Turki Al-Sheikh is serious when he spouts off stuff like this, or is he basically just puffing out his chest?
Well, I'd be curious where he's getting the 700 million from, because as wealthy as he is, I don't think he has that kind of cash available. I think that would have to come from the PIF fund, right? Mm. Or the General Sports Fund, which is not going to approve 700 million for one boxing match. Mm-hmm. But if it is true, and I saw that too, and I have no clue if it's, I didn't see anything that confirmed it, saying it's a real offer, not just a joke. if I'm Paul and Tyson, I get together and just say, hit me right in the chin. I'm going down round one. We'll split it later.
Yeah.
Because there's no way. But yeah, if he's going to throw they're throwing that kind of money out, then yes, the UFC will also do the Ngannou fight. But I find that incredibly unrealistic. I mean, they throw the $190 million purse out for Tyson Usyk, and that's much. Those guys are going to make a lot of money, but that's even much higher than I think is actually being offered. So people, when the Saudis are involved, they seem to throw out extremely high numbers. And it's true based on, like we saw with Match Frame's finances, with what Joshua makes, with the filings with the company house, with Joshua and Fury, that we can see that they're making a lot of money from the Saudis, but they're not making the kind of money. They're making, let's say, I would not be shocked that I think it's very plausible that Tyson and Usyk both are each going to make over $100 million in their two fights. So over $200 million combined easily. But I do not believe that they're making around $100 million each in one fight. So people just seem to exaggerate the numbers that the Saudis are paying.
Based on previous comments, I already know how confident you are that this fight with Jones and Ngannou can be made. It can be possible. Why do you think that? Tell everybody else why you think that, because we've talked about it many times off air. Tell everybody on air why you think that. Well,
when I say it's possible, I don't believe it's possible as a co-promotion with PFL. I don't think the UFC is going to work with PFL. PFL, as we know, is all gung ho. That's right now. They are desperate to get that fight made. They would love to have it made, and then even if they've got, let's say, a minority share of the revenue of it, because they just want to be on equal par with the UFC, at least on one fight. But I think it's possible, namely because Ngannou's current contract situation, his contract is going to come to an end very soon. And instead of co-promoting, the UFC could just sign him directly. Or if the UFC doesn't want to work with him, technically, the Saudis, if Turkey wants to make the fight, Turkey, Al Sheikh could sign him, and then he could co-promote with the UFC. I don't think they would have a problem co-promoting with the Saudis. Because they're not really in competition with them, but they can skip the problem of having to co-promote with the PFL because, as we know, France has one fight left, and his contract has a lot of terms that make it very difficult to extend it much beyond the length that it has. So he will be available coming up next year sometime.
Does PFL even have the money to finance Ngannou's last contracted fight if the Saudis don't pony up the money to cover it?
I mean, I think they have the money, they have the capital, but is it a good use of their resources? If you look at, the Bellator fighters stuff, they're not throwing money around. And that's a $10 million for Ngannou, $2 million for his opponent. That's an expensive bout. I think I'm not sure that they do it. In other words, I think their burn rate is high, and in many ways, up till now, buying Bellator, signing Jake Paul, he hasn't had any fights. Ngannou, they had one fight. For the most part, those guys, all those moves have been promotional tools instead of actually putting money behind it. So I would guess that they not that they need the Saudis, but man, do they like the Saudis covering the costs for a Francis Ngannou fight.
What about the news of a possible fight between Francis and Deontay Wilder? Because I saw this week that's been floated out now.
I think that's very possible. I think, in some ways, if the PFL cannot come up with an opponent for Francis that makes sense, taking a boxing match makes sense. That's one of the benefits of having his contract. Also, it might potentially pay him a lot more, right? So there's that. If PFL can't get an opponent, he has a potential to box and make more money. Why not do that? If I'm PFL, though, and I'm trying to make a splash, I would be desperate to see somehow if I could be the person that promotes the Francis Deontay Wilder bout.
But how would they do that? Because, Deontay Wilder ain't doing it for $2 million.
Well, they would have to come up with a lot of money, but maybe like we talked about previously, the site fee that they got for the Ngannou fight, I haven't confirmed it, but what I heard that it was very high, that they got a tremendous UFC level site fee for the last PFL event with Francis. They can get something where the Saudis put up the majority of money and cover a lot of it, and then basically hand over all the pay-per-view revenue to Francis and Deontay. then maybe they can get the bout made. It would have to be, like I said, a hybrid MMA fight and not a boxing match, because you're trying to promote the PFL as something that's not boxing, and why do it as a boxing match in the PFL? But I would try to book that fight. But if not, nothing's stopping Francis contractually to go and try to get a fight with Deontay Wilder. And I'm sure if the Saudis put up enough money, it's a big enough fight. It seems worthwhile to him. And I see no reason why he wouldn't do it.
Who would be the A side there? Because I'm sitting here and I'm thinking to myself, Deontay Wilder is on the other side of the mountain now. And Francis is kind of as well, but he seems like his star is a little brighter right now. Am I looking at this wrong?
No, I don't. I think you're. I mean, if you look at like Google Trends, which is not the best thing, in the world to look at, but you look at Google Trends, you see Francis has tremendous awareness, not just around the world, but in the United States, where Deontay's has faded over the last 5 years. And that's one reason I think, like Google Trends, you look at that, you go, well, Francis Jones would be a massive fight, because, again, just put that up, you'll see that Jones is super well known in the United States, much higher than Aspinall, much higher Pereira. But Francis is, the next highest at heavyweight. And then you go into around the globe, Francis is actually the most well-known MMA fighter. So I think that's why I think a Jones-Francis fight would just do blockbuster numbers, even though, people would say, oh, Francis has a prove he's a pay-per-view draw. To casuals, they would know the name, though, and you'd have Jones in him. Deontay kind of the similar, I think, where Francis is actually a bigger, more well-known figure now, but it's in boxing. And so if you're trying to entice him, I think in some ways you give Deontay Wilder, I don't know, purse split probably close to 50-50. Actually there's no purse split because the Saudis would be putting up the money, right? There's no split of like the revenue, because the Saudis would probably pay a large flat sum for the event, because you're not going to get some outside revenue, because as we talk about, events in Saudi Arabia are not selling a lot in the United States. They're not even targeting the American audience much. But in that situation, I think you make Deontay the A side merely because he's got a longer career, more renowned career in boxing, and that's how you get the fight made.
Now, you've said that Francis has been in a tremendous position with regards to his options. We've been saying that for the past year. Why? Especially now. At 38, pushing 40 years old, his options are better now than they've ever been. Why?
Yeah, I don't think this is something I think a lot of people in MMA kind of miss, is where he's at contractually, right? And where, I mean, the options he has and the leverage he has that no one else in mixed martial arts has. And you look at it, yes, he's getting old, but he's a heavyweight, so he probably has several years left him at heavyweight, right? He doesn't look like he's just dropped off the cliff yet, right? Mm-hmm. He still looks like his last performance, he beat the crap out of the problem. So he still looks like he might have it. But as we talked about, one thing as we mentioned, his contract is close to done. So he's not contractually bound. When people think of MMA fighters, they often think, oh, it's impossible to make a fight because, especially like a co-promote, two fighters are signed to do two different promotions. Like, we can never get that fight because these guys are signed. And when you're in a promotion, you're locked in for long term. He is not. His contract, he has one fight left, and he made sure there's limits to how long they can retain him. So he has basically a sunset provision, a limited amount of exclusive negotiating and matching rights. So his contract. So if PFL does not give him a fight sometime next year, sometime in the first half of next year, probably, unless they mutually agree to extend it, his contract's terminated and he's a free agent. I think he'll take one fight because he's always been the kind of guy like, I finish my contracts. So he's not going to wait it out. But he has that option. He can either take one fight left, be done, or just wait till the contract terminates. And now he has options to go to the UFC, where he's still the linear champion. A Jones fight would be massive, as we said about the Google Trends, right? It would just be huge. Any fight, basically him versus, the UFC champion would also be huge. Maybe not as big, but it'd still do monster numbers. So he can negotiate with UFC. PFL desperately is going to need him back because they're going to need him for their next TV deal. So he has those two options. He can play against each other. UFC might also want to sign him to prevent him from being with the PFL. And then finally, he has the option to go box, and he could box, like we said, Wilder. If he wins, he has more boxing opportunity then. So he has options that no one else, not Conor McGregor, who apparently, maybe Conor McGregor's contract was terminated, but not Conor McGregor, not Sean O'Malley, not any fighter that people throw out as the biggest guy, Ilia Topuria, any of them.
Jon Jones.
Jon Jones. There's a specific. Jon Jones, the biggest, the number one pound for pound guy in history. He's locked in a long-term UFC contract. He doesn't have anywhere close to the options a Francis Ngannou has right now.
What kind of contract do you think it would take to get Francis to go back to the UFC or to re-sign with the PFL?
Well, the UFC, the problem with the UFC contract are twofold. One is the UFC is not going to want to pay him so much it breaks the model that they have. They don't want other fighters to see that this guy is going to make a ton of money. I think there's ways around that. The other hurdle is much bigger in some ways, is that the UFC also does not want to offer him a contract where they have that he basically walks in, wins a fight, and he's back to being a free agent with more leverage.
Can I ask you something really fast?
Yes.
Okay, regarding that, remember when we had James Toney come in and fight Randy Couture?
Yes, I do remember that.
How come we couldn't do something like that for Francis? Just a one-off thing?
Well, because Francis, they know, has a shot at winning.
Okay.
And James Toney, they knew, had no shot at winning.
Gotcha. Okay.
And they also pitted James Toney against an older fighter. So on worst case scenario, something happened. Then you would be like, well, he beat an older guy. It's not that big a deal. I think they might even had an option still on that contract. Also, you got to remember, a funny thing about the James Toney story is originally they were going to put James Toney versus Chuck Liddell.
Oh my God.
That was supposedly the original plan. and Randy Couture went up to him and said, no, I should fight him. And he goes, no, I should fight him because Chuck is going to want to sit and stand with him and he could lose. I'm not going to let that happen. I mean, that's supposedly what I heard, he said. So take it with a grain of salt.
It totally makes sense. And it sounds like Randy.
Yeah. So like, Liz, you want me to fight him because I will ankle pick him, get him to the ground, and it'll be over. And exactly what he did. So that's one reason they were confident that Toney wasn't a threat. Now with Francis, he's already beaten up. He's already been the heavyweight champion. It wouldn't be shocking that he knocks out the UFC heavyweight champion or whoever they put him against. So you'd want to have a multi-fight deal, but Francis, again, doesn't want to be locked in. I think at this point, though, at his age, they could probably have a deal where, like, Francis, like, we are going to give you a couple fights guaranteed. If you win, we have options to keep you, maybe to get around paying you. I'm imagining to pay him, they'll have to pay, let's say, I'm just going to throw out a number, but a little more than what they offered him before. Let's say $12 million, but we will start you at the maximum $5 pay-per-view buy, very low, which is nowhere near what he's going to want. But on the side, maybe he gets to wear a Riyadh season patch, and maybe Turkey gets to sponsor him, give him a sponsorship deal for $10 million directly.
Wow.
Something where the UFC is not responsible for paying him, so that he can come out of a Jones fight with like 30 million plus, a large enough amount, a contract that's not endless, but the UFC has options to keep him around. If I was him too, and they're listening, possible right in the contract, you cannot make less on your second fight than you did in your first. That way they can't put you in a situation where, you're in a place where you're not going to sell as much and you're not going to make as much, but that's just neither here or there. But he has options. He can make those kind of demands, and it's conceivable the UFC would go along. Because going into a new deal, it would be great to go to your new partners. We are going to have the biggest heavyweight fight in history as soon as we sign this pay-per-view deal with you.
Quick question. Wait, yes. Because I have to go back for a second to something you said. You said, and then Turkey could sponsor him for something like $10 million. Okay. Is it possible that Turkey's already done that and we don't know it and it hasn't been figured into what Francis has already made? I'm just curious if maybe he's already gotten that deal and we just didn't know. I
mean, it's conceivable. I was on the lookout at his PFL show because he has a right in his contract. He gets two of his own sponsors. And his sponsorship was basically just his promotion. All right. Oh. It was Predator or not Predator. What was the two promotions he had? He had a Fumble the Bag and then the other one, his own two companies.
Okay.
So that tells me either he couldn't get sponsorship because of, he failed to negotiate, asked for too much, or they conflicted with the PFL. You notice he didn't thank the PFL after he won either. So I think that's worth noting as well.
Yeah, he only thanked Riyadh season, and he invited everybody to go to Riyadh.
Yeah, so I mean, he might have a private personal sponsorship deal with them. I know there were some talks about that when he was not negotiating with the Joshua fight. So it's possible he has a deal with them that pays him money to be a spokesperson, ambassador to Riyadh season. But I was just trying to think outside the box: is how do you pay him a large enough fee that makes sense, considering kind of his leverage as a free agent? Because he also got to compete with the PFL. Now, PFL can't offer as much. Right now they give him a deal where he gets paid to be on the board for PFL Africa, gets to buy shares, he gets free equity, he gets all these other side things, plus his basically $10 million with the PFL. They're never selling enough pay-per-views with the opponents he has to get the pay-per-view bonus. But if they want to keep him around and he has a UFC offer, they might have to offer him, like 15, 16 million guaranteed, plus a bunch of other stuff.
Could they even conceivably do that though?
Well, again, if they need him, if they desperately need Francis to sign to get a TV deal that they want, because that's their whole goal. Their whole goal is they've made this entity. The UFC is going to sign somewhere, and where the UFC doesn't sign, or perhaps where they sign, they are going to offer themselves as another MMA product. You're going to want to have us to fill the void, and we're going to make a bunch of money because we are the only alternative. Well, it's easier to sell that pitch set to stations if you got the guy you're claiming is the number one heavyweight, right? At least a star, someone people recognize and know. Without Francis, they don't have anybody like that, right? And so he can make tremendous demands. And the other thing they could do is they can expect and count on the Saudis to pick up the tab. We will hold events in Saudi Arabia, and we will use all the site fee money basically to pay Francis. So, we're now, he's, like I said, he's getting 10 million. Maybe he gets a guaranteed 16 million a fight, plus more benefits, more side stuff from that. And the UFC, they could easily clear that, but it's one thing to offer, the PFL tournament winner, right, and get 16 million. It's something else to get the same price to go against Jon Jones, where you're going to sell an event that sells multiple millions of pay-per-view buys. So he probably is not going to accept it for the same fee. So I think he will want a lot more money. And one of the ways that the UFC can offer him a lot more money without Jones or McGregor or anybody getting upset that he got a better deal than them is possibly going, hey, Turkey, you want to make this fight? You're so adamant about making this fight. Maybe pay him extras on a sponsorship deal on the side.
That sounds like a winning proposition right there. Now, let me ask you this. What do you think about PFL not booking the Bellator fighters, though? I mean, all of this sort of paints a really ugly picture. You've got Francis Ngannou, who's, their prize. And then they have all these high-ranked Bellator fighters, some champions, some ex-champions, and none of them are getting booked. And just today, Leandro Higo was out there once again begging for a fight.
Yeah, it's not a good look. The thing is, though, I do not think people are like, oh, this is terrible. The PFL, they're blowing it. Sadly, I don't think they're blowing it. I think this is, from their point of view, this is kind of smart because, again, they signed Jake Paul. Jake Paul has had no PFL fights, but they got a lot of press, and Jake Paul gets to be the spokesperson. I have no idea if he even has intent to fight in the PFL ever, but you get a lot of attention for him. They signed Francis Ngannou. For a year, he didn't fight for them. He finally did, but he did boxing. But you could trot him out and say, we have the number one heavyweight. And you can go to your investors and go to people that maybe they want to sell, your show to put on broadcast or sponsors. We have Francis Ngannou. He's coming eventually. Same with the Bellator. It's like, well, I think they signed Bellator partly because they get a lot of the Bellator deals that they could add to their finances, but also now, as we talked about recently, one of their big sales pitches is look at the number of top fight matrix fighters we have. We put a product out that's very similar to the UFC. Bellator had a lot of those top ranked fighters, and they could point to and say, look at the rankings. We have so many more ranked fighters now under Bellator and PFL than we did before. We are competing with the UFC. which is in some ways is good to have those ranked fighters, especially if you're trying to sign UFC fighters, because then you have opponents for them. But the whole point is they had a sales pitch. They could continue to pitch to investors, potential investors, to potential networks and broadcasters, to sponsors that look at all the stuff we have. Look at we're going in the right direction. But the one thing they don't want to do then is those Bellator fighters had bigger contracts. And you want them to have them on the roster, but you're not really gaining by putting events with them. So why have them fight? Why not just say you have them and not put them out there to fight and not pay? That way you don't have to pay them and incur the expense. So it's terrible in some ways. In many ways, it's terrible for the fighters, obviously terrible for fans that want to see these guys fight. But for a company that's, that's maybe not fully committed to putting on in the fight business and much more interested in the selling of the fight business, just having them on the roster was the benefit. So my thought sadly is it's terrible for the fighters. It's not how you should do business, but from the PFL point of view, it might not be that big a mistake.
From the fighters' point of view, do they have any kind of recourse at all?
Well, they could try challenging this. There was back in the days when Elite XC went bankrupt, and they eventually got sold to Showtime. They were the contracts. They took the Elite XC contracts and hauled onto the fighters, and that the contracts were used as security for a loan or a pledge for collateral. I can't remember exactly how it worked, but then they were sold to Showtime, and then eventually to Strikeforce. Well, this is somewhat similar in that the collateral, the Bellator fighters were, their contracts were listed as some sort of collateral and sold to PFL, and they haven't got any fights now. And so back then, what happened was first, I think it was Pat English, if I remember right. Pat English, I think it was the attorney, the boxing attorney, wrote a letter on behalf of Dave Herman and Hector Lombard. And then later, a bunch of managers went to Rob Macy of the antitrust lawsuit, the MMAFA, Mixed Martial Arts Fighters Association. And he wrote a letter on behalf of all fighters. And because of that, that's one of the reasons they sped up the deal with Showtime with Strikeforce and got the Strikeforce contracts done so people could start going back to fights. They could do something like that, I think, is, look into what those guys did. I guess rework it to fit the situation. But I think you could file, at least threaten to file something with PFL to get them off their ass and either release you or get you booked or, do something with you along those lines. I think the one problem the Bellator fighters has is the market is really different now. One is not in the MMA business anymore, really, are they?
No.
Doesn't look that way.
No.
There are no major promotions out there. When Elite XC went under, there was still Strikeforce out there. Bellator was just springing up. There were a potential Dream was still going on in Japan. There were potential kind of places you could go fight. Now it's rising a little bit, but mostly it's the UFC's and PFL. So if you're not getting along with PFL, you got to go to the UFC, and they probably already made clear what they think your price is. So for a lot of these fighters, it's like we had to send a good deal with Bellator. We got bought by PFL, and now they don't want to pay us. Do I want to get let go by PFL and maybe go somewhere where I won't make the purse I was getting paid from Bellator, or do I want to wait and see if PFL will honor that agreement and actually pay me that purse? That's the dilemma I think a lot of these fighters have.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Should they just go ahead and call up Rob Macy right now? Because that's what I would be doing. To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!